So good morning. I'm going to be talking a little bit about read-alouds today. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you, and we're going to be watching some videos that are part of the videos that we created to align with the literacy essentials. And we're going to take some time to discuss some of those and some different ways that read-alouds can work in the classrooms. As I know that you've already been discussing, there's a lot of research support for read-alouds in elementary classrooms. And we want to start reading to children when they're very young, actually before school, right? And continue reading aloud into the middle school years and beyond. That is because when we read aloud to young children, it supports some of the areas of literacy development that they're probably not going to get from the texts that they read independently, particularly in the early grades. So knowledge development, vocabulary development, comprehension development, right? These are really important parts of kids' learning, but the texts that they read independently do not have a lot of challenging words and concepts for them. And this is on purpose, right? We try to keep those texts pretty simple so that when they decode the word, they can really recognize it, and it maps to something that they know in their oral language. But what we can do through read-alouds is expand beyond what kids know and start to introduce them to some of the new types of language that they're going to experience in different types of texts. The big point that we're going to discuss today, hopefully everyone's on board that we should be reading aloud with children, is that read-alouds can be enhanced when we include explicit teaching as part of the read-aloud. So we make a plan and we have something specific we're hoping that children will learn through the read-aloud. That can be word meanings, it could be concepts about print, it could be supporting discussion, vocabulary, knowledge building, comprehension. There's a ton to teach in read-alouds, but the idea is that we're teaching something through read-alouds. One of the challenges, even though I was just saying we're all on board with read-alouds, is that when we actually take a look at what's happening in classrooms, and this is from a study that I did a little while back, we find that often they actually don't happen or happen for a very short amount of time. So when we observed in over 65 classrooms, we found only 8.3 minutes per day of read-alouds of literature and 1.36 minutes per day read-aloud of informational text. So what does that really mean? 1.36 minutes averaged across a lot of classrooms. It means that a few classrooms had an informational text read-aloud, but most of those classrooms had 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, right? A lot of zeros bring that number down to 1.36 minutes. So nobody took out a book and read it for 1.36 minutes. That's the average. So why is this concerning? Well, if we say there are decades of research telling us that children can learn so much from read-alouds, we should be really concerned if they're not happening in our classrooms every day. And as part of the literacy essentials, Essential 2 is saying that we should have an interactive read-aloud in every classroom every day. Okay, so some key ideas, and these were in the article that you read, but I just want to highlight a few key ideas about interactive read-alouds. Most importantly, effective instructional practices from the research for read-alouds are interactive. So what does that mean? That means that children are actively involved in thinking about and talking about the read-aloud text. So this looks a lot different to sort of what I would call an old-fashioned read-aloud, which is the teacher's reading aloud. It's a performance. It's kind of like going to a play, and the children are told to be quiet, crisscross applesauce, zip it, lock it, put it in your pocket, and be listeners absorbing text. Turns out that in fact, is not the most effective situation for kids to learn all they can from a read-aloud. And that it's the extra textual talk, the talk that happens around the text, so not the words in the text, but the discussion between teachers and children, the interaction that facilitates children's literacy development. So I'm not saying that kids will learn nothing if they have to sit quietly and listen to texts. What I'm saying is they learn more when the read-aloud is interactive. So we're looking for interactive read-alouds, we're looking for substantial extra textual talk. If the kids are sitting silently, that's not an interactive read-aloud. And the talk can happen during the text. Sometimes we stop and we ask questions or have some discussions. It could also happen directly after the read-aloud text. And I'll show you some different examples of that today. A couple other really important things. Well, if we want read-alouds to be interactive and we want the extra textual talk to be productive and focused on a learning goal for children, then read-alouds need to be purposeful and planned. So if we grab any book off a shelf and just kind of read it, and the teacher has no idea what's going to happen either, then it's not going to be planned well enough to have this instructional purpose and some explicit instructional goals. So what kinds of things should we be considering when we're planning? So effective read-aloud techniques are purposeful and planned, and that means thinking about which text matches the instructional purpose for the day, how and when the text will be read, what the teacher will explain or model for the students, the types of questions that will be asked or ideas that will be discussed, and vocabulary words that might be discussed. So not all of those things in one read-aloud, but these are the kinds of thoughts we're going to have ahead of time. So if we think about an interactive read-aloud, it's a lesson, right? So it's going to go better, much better, if it's planned. Okay. What else? We want to see interactive read-alouds across the school day. So they are not only going to happen in the language arts block. Why? Because if these build knowledge and vocabulary and ideas, why can't that happen in all of the areas that we're teaching? So your interactive read-aloud could be during science one day or social studies. It could happen during art or math. So this is not something that only happens during English language arts. And in fact, for informational texts, they may most fit in the disciplines where we make use of informational text, typically, right? So think about science, social studies, mathematics. We want interactive read-alouds to occur across a broad range of content areas, and it's not, again, not stuck in that language arts time. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Some things that we don't want for read-alouds, okay? So here's the what not to do part of the presentation. Not a performance by the teacher, and I already explained that because then it's not interactive. Not grab any book off the shelf, because then it won't be planned. Okay, so again, it's not going to harm children or break their brains if we read them a book that we just grabbed off the shelf, but it's not going to provide optimal learning for children. And instructional time is so precious that we really want to make sure that we have that interactive read-aloud, the planned, focused, interactive read-aloud every single day. That's what Essential 2 is all about. It's not optional or something to skip because we ran out of time. And you can tell from those numbers I showed you about minutes per day that happens a lot, right? A read-aloud is a 10, 15-minute activity or occurrence, maybe 20 minutes. And so when time gets short, it's easy to say, oh, I just won't get to my read-aloud today. But if we think about all that kids can learn from that part of the day, it's very problematic that's what's getting skipped. Okay. Not the kitchen sink read-aloud. I work with pre-service teachers, so I see a lot of kitchen sink read-alouds. That's when we teach everything in one read-aloud. So it looks something like this. We teach kids what the author is. We teach them what the illustrator is, even though they've been learning that every day since kindergarten. We do a picture walk. We teach a comprehension strategy. We have kids summarize the text. We teach 4 vocabulary words. After the text, we try to have a text-based discussion. By that time, the kids are rolling around on the floor, and then we're doing a lot of discipline talk. So that's a kitchen sink read-aloud. Everything is happening in one read-aloud, and that doesn't need to happen, right? So we can have 1 or 2 instructional goals for a read-aloud. That's reasonable. We don't need to do everything every time, right? So some text might be really great for teaching vocabulary. Another text might be really great for teaching science concepts. Another text might be really great for teaching concepts about print, right? So those don't have to all happen all the time. And we can also reread the same text for multiple purposes, or read part of a text on one day for one purpose and part of a text on another day. We can also read the whole text and revisit it later, only look at parts of it for a particular learning goal. So there are lots of ways to get around the kitchen sink read-aloud, even with a really great book where there's lots to learn. And then too long for kids of that age. And I always get the question, well, what's the right amount of time? And the answer is research does not tell us the right amount of time. And that makes a lot of sense because it's going to depend on the kids. It's going to depend on the class. It's going to depend on whether or not they had recess before the read-aloud or not, right? And how excited and engaged they are in the text. So there's lots of factors here. So it's not a right amount of time. 1.36 minutes is too short. That's not going to work, but enough time to read the text and make sure that there is some interaction around the text, or to read part of the text and have some interaction, right? It's not about length of time. It's about what happens during that time and the quality of what is going on. Okay, so I'm going to talk through some of the text, not all of it today. We just won't get to all of it. That would take us, usually when I get to all of it, it takes 4 hours. So I'm going to talk about some of the text from Essential 2. And Essential 2 says, read alouds of age-appropriate books and other materials, print or digital. So again, the teacher is typically reading aloud to the students, and the ultimate goal is to give children access to texts that they're not yet able to read independently, and the learning that that text can provide. So one of the first bullets from the Essentials says, read alouds of sets of texts across read aloud sessions that are thematically and conceptually related and that offer opportunities to learn that children could not yet experience independently. So we've already talked a little bit about opportunities to learn that children could not yet experience independently, but let's talk a little bit about the sets of texts, because this is an area where we can make some kind of small scale changes with a lot of bang for our instructional buck, I guess, a lot of learning for kids. Okay, so sometimes it's easier to explain what things are by what they're not. So here's not a text set. It's Informational Text Week. So on Monday, we read about coral reefs. On Tuesday, we read about the sun. On Wednesday, we read about wolves. On Thursday, about glaciers. And on Friday, we're going to read about birds. Okay. So this is not a set of texts that are conceptually or thematically related in any way. They're about totally different topics with totally different concepts. Okay. So that's not a text set. Here is a text set. Okay. Here are 5 texts that all focus on weather and climate in kindergarten, where this aligns with some of the science standards that kids are gonna learn about weather and weather forecasting. So what could example B do for kids that example A can't? Well, when we read a set of texts that are all related, we're likely to see some natural repetition of the vocabulary and the ideas across the texts. So we're deepening students' knowledge about that topic or theme. And why is that important? Because knowledge and vocabulary are critical for text comprehension. So if you read 5 books about weather and you know a lot about weather and you've built up a lot of vocabulary about weather, it's likely that book 6, say you maybe read a book independently about weather, that you're going to have a lot more knowledge and vocabulary and ideas to bring to that reading, supporting your comprehension. And so most adults have kind of experienced this. Maybe you took a college level course where the readings at the beginning of the semester seemed baffling, but as you continued to read on the topic, right, over time, they became more and more familiar and your comprehension improved. And probably if you went back and read one of those first texts at the end of the semester, you'd say, oh, this all makes sense to me now. That is kind of what we're going to do for kids when we read aloud from text sets. And some colleagues and I have done some studies where we actually found that when you give kids read-alouds of text sets compared to read-alouds of sort of not a text set, random texts that are unrelated, the kids who read aloud the text sets, they obviously build more knowledge about that topic than the kids who maybe read only one book. They learn more of the vocabulary associated with that topic. They pick up more vocabulary incidentally, so vocabulary that just happened to be in the text that we never thought they would learn. And we think this is because they have good knowledge about the rest of it, so they have time and cognitive attention to pay to some extra vocabulary. And when we gave them a new text on the same topic, they were better at comprehending those texts than the kids who had not read deeply on that topic. So there's a relatively simple switch, right? When it's time to think about informational texts, in particular, let's think about reading them in sets, but we can also have sets in fiction, right? We can do an author study and read a bunch of texts by the same author. We can read texts that have themes, right? Themes that are similar across the texts, right? So maybe themes of friendship or themes of kindness, right? We can read several texts on that. Okay, so that's the first bullet. The next bullet is pretty long and complex, so I'm actually going to show you a video to illustrate it, but I'll read it first, and then we will come back to this text, what it says here in the essentials, with the video in mind. Here's what it says. Read-alouds involve child-friendly explanations of words within the text and revisiting of those words after reading, using tools such as movement, props, video, photo, examples and non-examples, and engaging children in saying the words aloud and using the words at other points in the day and over time. So that sounds like a lot. This is describing a vocabulary-focused interactive read-alouds. And I want to show you an example of what this looks like. But first, just a reminder that there is an interaction between reading comprehension and vocabulary. So what happens is reading with comprehension. When we read a text with comprehension, we can learn something about new words in that text, the few new words we don't know. Okay? So that's wonderful. So we can gain vocabulary just from reading. But vocabulary can, if there are too many vocabulary words we don't understand in a text, too many words we don't know the meaning, that can actually impede our comprehension of the text. So you need vocabulary to understand text. You can also pick up vocabulary from text that you understand really well. So it's kind of a cycle. And for young children, we really want to make sure they're comprehending the text we read aloud. And that one way to support that is to make sure that children, we are explaining any words that are challenging that might impede their comprehension, but also taking the opportunity to use text to build some new vocabulary that kids may not have. During the read aloud, what we're going to want to do is some explicit vocabulary instruction before or during reading. And we're going to want to introduce children to words that may not be in our everyday oral language. So the language of text is different to the language we speak with when we interact typically. Just think about classroom talk that's not around a text. Let's go to our seats, let's zipper our coats, everybody have everything to go home, versus the type of much more sophisticated language that is in a text. So we're going to use this text as an opportunity to teach some text types of words to kids. So I'm going to show you a vocabulary-focused interactive read-aloud. And afterwards, we're going to have a little opportunity for you to discuss at your table, and then we'll discuss together some important questions about this video. So what are the instructional goals for this read-aloud? So what did the teacher have in mind? What was she hoping kids would learn? Why was this text appropriate for the goals? So the actual book that she selected, did it make sense? What strategies were used to accomplish these goals? So what did the teacher do beyond the text? So we're talking about extra textual talk, right? And what had the teacher planned to accomplish her goals? And anything else you notice or want to ask about. So again, the teacher's goals, was the text appropriate, and what did she do to accomplish the goals for kids learning? Okay, so this is the website for the Literacy Essentials. And you can see that there are videos for each essential. These are the essential 2 videos that we're going to take a look at today. And these are Michigan teachers who were so wonderful and allowed us into their classrooms to videotape. Okay, so if you could talk at your tables just for a little bit and think through these questions, then we can discuss as a group. What are the instructional goals for this read aloud? Why was this text appropriate for these goals? And what strategies did the teacher use to accomplish these goals? And anything else you notice or want to ask about, or that you want to ask a question to me about. Okay, so take a few minutes to talk at your table or with a group of people nearby. I'm going to try to hear some of what folks are thinking. What are the instructional goals for this read aloud?
Challenging words and synonyms.
Okay. So what about the challenging words and synonyms? What is her actual goal for children's learning?
So she chose the words that challenged them, not the words that they were already familiar with.
Okay, so one of her goals is for children to learn some challenging new words, and some of those words were synonyms. Okay, what was her other goal? Or what were other goals? There's at least one more. Sometimes people say 2.
Applying the vocabulary from that text in other contexts.
Okay, so applying the words from that text in other contexts. And I would say that's part of learning the meaning of those words, right? So not just learning their meaning in the text, but learning it beyond the text. So that for me is sort of a strategy for supporting them and really deepening their knowledge of the meaning of some words. Okay, but one other thing that was going on here, her other goal was to support their comprehension of the text, right? So she was supporting their comprehension of the text by making sure that they understood the meanings of challenging words as she was reading aloud the text. Okay, so there was a comprehension goal during the read, and then afterwards she wanted to go back to some words, a smaller set of words, to make sure kids really deepened their knowledge of that set of words. And third, and this is the third one people sometimes say, and it was sort of mentioned, is this understanding that words in our language have synonyms, right? So there are multiple ways to say the same idea. So that's a really interesting thing for kids to know about our language and how it works. Okay. So was the text appropriate for these goals? You can give me kind of a yes or no as a group.
Yes.
Everyone saying yes. Okay, so why was it appropriate? She wanted to accomplish these goals.
Because it would have been difficult independently.
So yeah, right. It had great vocabulary words in it that she could teach. So if she wants to have a goal of teaching kids words, supporting their comprehension, teaching them words, teaching them about synonyms, all of these things could happen with this text. So it's a really great text for this. She could have, if she had this idea, I'm going to teach them vocabulary today, and just grab the book off the shelf, that book might have not been appropriate for these goals. Okay. All right. So she did a lot of things to accomplish these goals. So let's talk about supporting kids' comprehension during the read aloud. What did she do? What did she do for that?
Child-friendly definitions.
Right. So she did these child-friendly explanations of the words. And what did she do? How was she able to slip those in and help kids' comprehension right there in the text?
They were really quick, and she already had them marked in the book, which ones she would do.
She had them marked, she had them planned, she had them written down on Post-it notes. I mean, she typed them on Post-it notes, which is really awesome, but she was getting videoed and knew that anyone anywhere on YouTube could watch her. Okay, so we don't have to type them, but we can handwrite them, right? But there's definitely a plan, right? She'd been through the text, she'd marked the words, she had actually planned out what she was going to say. And I'll tell you, I've been talking about vocabulary for a lot of years now. It is still hard for me to come up with a nice, concise, child-friendly explanation without a plan. I mean, I get there and I'm trying to explain it. I'm thinking about it. If I've planned it ahead of time, I know what I'm going to say. It's easy. It's short. It's in the moment. It doesn't interrupt kids' comprehension. And my recommendation on that is write it on a Post-it note. If you think the kids understood the word from that, then take that Post-it note and transfer it to something a little more permanent, like an actual, sticker label, and stick it on the back of the book or on the inside back cover of the book, so that next time you use that book, you don't have to redo all that thinking about which words and what the explanation is. They're just stuck in there. And the reason I say something more permanent is because one of my memories when I was a kindergarten teacher, there were always I'd pull a book off the shelf and Post-it notes would fly down, right? They fall off, they get lost. So something a little more permanent. Okay, so that's how she supported kids' comprehension. What did she do to support her goal of making sure kids really learned the meaning of this set of words? A lot of extension activities. So let's talk through some examples of them. Hint, hint, the text from the Literacy Essentials. So what did we see happening that aligns with this? Okay, I can hear people saying there were photos, and those photos were examples and non-examples, and the kids got to manipulate those. So that's a couple of these. What else? Okay.
Movement.
Right. There was some movement or acting out, right? The kids got to act out the examples. What else?
Saying the words again and again, practicing them.
They said the word, she said the words, but also the kids said the words. So that really helps kids to hold the words when they actually say it themselves. It turns out it's called having a phonological representation of the word. So she had kids say the word. She also showed them the word so they could see the lexical representation, the spelling of the word. So lots of different inputs, right? Hear it, say it, see it, act it out. Okay, what else? What did she do with the word remarkable?
She talked about the part of the word.
Parts, right? So she actually showed the children how that word's meaning was sort of within the different parts of the word. So talking about word parts is also really great because that's, again, a strategy kids can use beyond this moment. And all of this was planned, right? She knew what she was doing. That entire lesson that you just watched, I mean, the video was 10 minutes. The lesson was probably, we clipped parts together, but the lesson was probably about 15 to 20 minutes altogether. Okay, and it was efficient. And then don't forget, she made connections to other points in the day. So she said, we're going to try to use some of these words in our writing, in our poetry. So once we teach kids words, we want them to use those words. So what I would say is this looks like a lot and it looks really hard, but with a plan, it's not that much. And we don't have to do all of the things with all the words. We just want kids to have some active processing of the word. So what is active processing? Again, they're thinking about or using the words in meaningful ways to try to help them hold the meaning of the words that we want them to learn. Okay, so that's a vocabulary focused read aloud. Anything else you noticed or want to ask me about before I move on to a different kind of read aloud?
We do have one question. 1 second.
Quick question. How often would the teacher revisit these words throughout the week, and would they use the same activities or come up with new activities?
So we don't have a set number of how often words need to be revisited for kids to learn them. It sort of depends on how useful the words are to children. What I would say, what I actually really love to do is to create word collections. So they were sort of starting to collect words that mean confused or unsure, right? Something like that. And then when kids are writing, I would say, oh, you used the word confused or said the character, they didn't know. Is there another one of these words we could revisit from our collection? Or I would be trying to use the words myself. So one thing is, if we have a plan and we know which words we're teaching, we would use those words. So I would be saying, I thought I asked everyone to get ready for lunch, but you're all looking a little bewildered, right? Like you didn't hear what I had to say. Do you remember what bewildered meant? So I would be looking for really naturalistic ways to make these words come back in ways that were meaningful to the work of the classroom. Sometimes that's actually a lot easier with informational text words, because if we're learning a bunch of words about weather and it aligns with our science work about weather, it's easy to make those words come back. So we have to work a little harder to think about words and their relationships in fiction.
Thank you.
Okay, and I want to talk about another thing we can do with read aloud. But one thing that we can do that we want to do with read alouds is that there's more and more evidence that higher order discussion supports kids' comprehension. So what's higher order discussion? That's discussion focused on encouraging students to think deeply about what the text means and apply ideas rather than just recalling details. So it's not what was the main character's name or what color was the house in the story. This is, what do you think? Why did the author do that? What did they mean? Do you agree? How does this compare to what you already know? What's the author's perspective? What's the author trying to accomplish? What's the author saying about the world? What are the themes, right? These are the big kinds of questions that we think about with text. And it turns out that having these kinds of discussion, these big question discussions with little children, it really does support their comprehension, right? Because we are making meaning together in a way that we're hoping they're going to start to make meaning individually when they engage with text. So I want to show you an example of what this might look like in a kindergarten classroom. It's not going to be perfect, but it is trying to undo the typical classroom interaction, right? Which is the teacher asks a question, one student answers, the teacher evaluates the response, then the teacher asks another question. So what was the main character's name? Cinderella. Good. Where did she live? Wherever the kid answers, good. Right? This is an open question where there are multiple answers, so multiple students can respond, think, agree, disagree. And the teacher's role is really to summarize and facilitate this conversation rather than to have a right answer in mind. Okay. So take a look at what this might look like in a kindergarten classroom, and this is one critical way that we can support kids' comprehension. Okay, so as you're going to watch this, you're going to be thinking about What was the teacher's instructional goal? Although I kind of just told you, is this text appropriate? And also take a look, even though we're just going to watch for a few minutes, what instructional strategies the teacher was using to support those goals. Okay, so we don't have a ton of time, but I do want to just share some thoughts about that example. So I've already said the instructional goals are to support very young children in having a text-based discussion, right? And this is going to look a lot different when we have third, fourth graders who are in small groups who could facilitate some of this themselves. Why was the text appropriate? I think it was appropriate because the open-ended question was, what are we going to learn from this text? And there was a lot to learn, right? So there were lots of options for kids to respond to that. Anyone want to share some strategies you saw the teacher use to accomplish these goals? We didn't necessarily see them all play out in the lesson, but she shared some of them with us. Right? So she had sentence stems, and, we didn't really hear a ton of the kids using them, but, she's reminding them those are some things they can do to respond. What else?
Clarification of thinking.
So she didn't really ask kids, what do you mean by that? But she did sort of she restated, right, what they were saying, sometimes using some more sophisticated language. And I think that has a couple of different purposes, right? It broadcasts kids' ideas. They're kindergartners. Not everyone always hears their ideas, but also it sort of affirms their ideas. It broadcasts their ideas. And if she was restating incorrectly, it gives kids the opportunity to say, well, that's not what I meant, right? And it also helps for the next children to have some time to think about what was said and then continue. I also heard her saying, can you add on? Also, if you look at how she'd seated the children, she kind of seated them so that they could see one another and the text, and she'd taken herself out of that. Even though she was still facilitating from the side, right, she was trying to convey just in the seating, right, that they were to look at one another and talk to one another. They're not yet there yet, but we're starting to do this kind of work. This is what it looks like in kindergarten, and it's going to look different when we get to older kids. So again, here they actually did not do the read aloud and they didn't do the read aloud and the text discussion in the same sitting, which I think is also another very important strategy for young children, right? By the time we've read the whole book, they're not really ready to sit and discuss. So they did the reading of the book, then they came back, then they discussed. She also had the text available. They could see it on the document camera. So just another way to have kids focused on the text, and what we don't see next is they actually consult the text to figure out what they're supposed to learn from that particular example. So a lot going on here, a lot of planning going into this, but you can really see how this is going to support kids' learning and their ability to participate in text-based discussion moving forward. So I just want to show you one more very short example. I'm going to skip some of what these are all different things we can do from read-alouds, but I want to talk a little bit about using read-alouds to support comprehension strategies. Okay. So when we think about comprehension strategies, there are some that have some evidence in research, and some of what is floating around schools does not have evidence from research. So the ones that actually have some evidence include activating prior knowledge or predicting, helping kids question the text, visualizing the text, monitoring for meaning when meaning doesn't make sense, and fixing it up, drawing inferences, and summarizing or retelling. So just a couple of points about these before we watch this video, which is actually an example of drawing inferences. First is we're trying to teach kids to be strategic, not a particular strategy. So being strategic means when I don't understand, I have some things I can try to help myself better understand the text, right? Just like you or I would as a reader. This doesn't make sense. I wonder why. What does the text really mean here? Should I reread? Let me see if I can picture it in my head. That's what these strategies are for, right? They're for fixing up when comprehension falls apart. So that means they're not all appropriate for every text. Visualizing is not appropriate for a text that has very little description in it. Maybe somebody's opinion piece, right? We can't visualize someone's opinion. So we're trying to help kids understand that there's not one strategy. We can't be like Monday is visualizing day, because maybe the text you're reading on Monday doesn't have an opportunity to visualize, right? We're really trying to teach kids that these are ways that they can help themselves as readers. The other thing is we're not, for drawing inferences in particular, because we're going to watch a video about that, we're not teaching kids to draw inferences in this world, right? I often hear people say, oh, my kids, they can't make inferences. And I just say, well, that's just not true, because you couldn't function in this world if you didn't make inferences. All the time people point to something and say, can you get me that? And you're supposed to infer what you're getting. That's an inference, right? You get to the movie theater, there's a line, you're supposed to infer that that's where you go get your ticket or where you're going to get in. So all of our children in our classroom can draw inferences. They wouldn't have made it to elementary school if they couldn't. Everyone draws inferences all the time. What we're trying to teach kids is to draw inferences with text, right? That they can and should be doing this. That the author of a text doesn't tell you every single thing you need to know. You need to bring some of your background knowledge to sort of fill in the gaps to what the author tells you or provides. Okay, that's the type of inferring we need kids to do with text. Okay. So again, we're teaching kids to be strategic. We're teaching them when and why to use different strategies. And I want to show you an example where a teacher's using the opportunity of a read-aloud text to teach or reteach or remind kids to make inferences. And again, what are the instructional goals? Was this text appropriate? And what strategies do you see her using? That text was obviously appropriate, right? Because it had lots for the kids to infer. They really can't understand. The whole purpose of the text is, right, what the dog is saying about the experience is not the same as what we're supposed to infer really happened. So lots of opportunities to make inferences in that text. You see the teacher explicitly explaining the strategy to kids and then guiding them through practice with that strategy. So just another instructional goal that we can plan using read-alouds. So just in summary, there are many instructional purposes that we can accomplish during read-alouds, way more than we discussed today. If you look at the text for essential instructional practice number 2, it's very long and has lots of different things we can teach during read-alouds. We talked about supporting vocabulary, supporting discussion, and supporting text comprehension through teaching strategies today, comprehension strategies. But of course, we can also teach kids about print and how it works. And we can teach kids about the different structures of texts. We can support kids' knowledge, especially aligned with our content area learning. So there's so much to teach. I think the main idea here is that we want to have interactive read-alouds every day. We want to make sure they really are interactive, which means we need to plan them. There should be an instructional goal in mind, and really think about it as a lesson, as any other lesson, to happen each day.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead. We had a chance to brainstorm some questions earlier, so I'm going to go through some of those.
Okay.
In your perspective, is there a difference between interactive read-alouds and shared reading?
Great question. So I think I had a slide somewhere that said interactive read-alouds, AKA shared reading. So some teachers, especially in the early childhood community, call interactive read-alouds shared reading, and they are synonyms, okay? But some teachers also called shared reading what I would call a print referencing read-aloud, which is where we have a big book and the kids see the text and maybe we're reading aloud, we're reading together, like we're actually sharing the reading. So it says like, brown bear, what do we see? And we're pointing and reading together, which is kind of a different thing to an interactive read-aloud. So I use the term interactive read-aloud just to make really clear that it's not, or not necessarily, the thing where we're all chanting the words together. If you're using shared reading to mean interactive read-aloud, that's fine. And especially early childhood teachers often say shared reading and they mean the same thing. So I would say interactive read-aloud is the fact that there is a text, there's a lot of interaction around it, it's planned and purposeful, and there's instructional goals associated with it.
How often would you suggest that students respond to respond to a read-aloud through writing?
My answer to this is to say this. What's the purpose of writing a response? What is the instructional goal we're trying to accomplish with that? What standard are we trying to meet? Why are they doing it? So that should guide how often they do it, right? So to me, writing in response to read aloud is an activity. It's a fine activity if there's some purpose for it. So maybe we are reading aloud a bunch of texts that have different point of views about a topic, and then we want kids to write their opinion about that topic. Well, that makes a lot of sense for kids to write in response to a read aloud. Maybe I'm reading aloud so kids can gather information on some topic that's important for science or social studies. It makes a lot of sense to me for kids to write in response to a read aloud. So I would say, like, what's your reason? What's your instructional purpose? And let that guide how often you do it. But if you're just doing it because you think that kids should write in response to a read aloud and there's no particular reason or standard, then don't do that. Right? Don't do that today. Don't do that unless you have a reason. Right?
How do we balance choosing books for joy or concept or theme or cultural relevancy? How do we choose or select which book to read at any time?
Okay, so I would say, yes to all of that, right? Essential 8 talks about having lots of different types of texts in the classroom and giving kids access to a broad range of texts. I don't think these things are mutually exclusive, right? So we could have a culturally relevant text and we're discussing it for themes about culture. And then we could look at that exact same text and teach some fantastic vocabulary in that text. So the same text could have multiple instructional goals. They don't necessarily all have to be accomplished kitchen sink on the same day. So I don't think these are really choices, right? I think, again, what's your goal? What's your purpose? So I would want to be reading books about concepts that were aligned to what my kids were studying in other parts of the day, in science and social studies and math. I would be wanting to teach vocabulary by sharing literature, but I would also take the opportunity to teach kids things about literature and how it works, like narrative text structure. But I would also discuss themes, right? Themes about the world. So I don't think that there's really choice there. Have great books, read aloud often, use them for the purposes that makes most sense to fitting in with what else you're doing, but to also for that particular book, right? What could that book text do for you?
How important is it for the students to have physical access to the books that are being read aloud? So should they be on their bookshelves as well?
I would say it depends. Again, what is your instructional purpose for putting them on the shelf? So with our young kids, they might want to page through or look at the pictures or retell the text that they've heard their teachers to read. Often in early childhood classrooms, we want them to have it, even though they can't read the words yet. They can start to do other things, right? Like they'll tell the stories, and that's a really important thing for young children to learn. If they're not doing that and you're just sticking it on a shelf and no one's ever going to touch it and they're just going to see that it's there, wouldn't put it on the shelf, right? It's okay to keep some special teacher books aside that you bring out to teach particular things. I think that that's great because they're not books that everybody's already seen and read a lot of times. If we're reading books thematically because they're related to something we're learning or conceptually related books, I would definitely want a bin of those books somewhere where kids could access them if they're going to use them in their thinking or in their learning or in their writing. So my answers have a theme here, which is, well, why are you doing it? What is this doing for kids? How is this supporting their learning? The other thing I would say is I wouldn't not give kids access to the book because they're only allowed to read books at their level, okay? Kids can read text at a range of levels depending on their interest and knowledge in the topic. So I also wouldn't withhold the text from children if they want to try to read it. How wonderful is that? If you read a book and they're excited about it and then they want to try reading it, let them try.
Great. One more question, and this has more to do with the research, but we know that there's a lot of research to support interactive read-alouds with K-3 students, but what about the older students?
Yeah, so there actually are studies with older students about read-alouds and particularly about the discussions kids can have around read-alouds and connecting different texts, right? This idea of it's called intertextuality, that kids can take ideas from one text and consider them in terms of ideas from the other text. So two authors who have differing perspectives, or additional information on another text, and the types of discussions that we can have through read-alouds with older kids. Also in the upper elementary grades, there's definitely evidence that kids continue to learn vocabulary through read-alouds. So we're now talking about, we're probably not teaching them how print works, right? Once we get to the upper elementary grade, we're not doing a print referencing read-aloud where the book is facing the kids, or we're not doing rhyming, right? We're starting to do vocabulary, knowledge, and text-based discussions, continuing to support kids in being strategic, right? So those are the kind of work we're going to do through read-alouds with older students. And remember, read-alouds with older students, for those who are interested, can also be chapter books. We can accomplish lots of instructional goals through chapter books. I often see teachers, it's like snack time, and the kids are eating their snack and talking to each other, and then the teacher's kind of reading a chapter book like as background noise to snack, and then the teacher critiques the children for not listening to the book while they're eating snack and talking to each other, which all seems very hard to me. So that's not an interactive read aloud, because no one's interacting around the text or even paying attention to the text. But that doesn't mean we can't do amazing interactive read alouds with a chapter, right? There could be great vocabulary, great themes to discuss, lots of opportunities to support comprehension strategies. So again, it's how can this text support my instructional goals for my students? Lots of opportunities to model the things we want kids to be doing independently as readers. Any last questions?
Nope, I think we're all set on our end.
Okay, well, I hope you have a wonderful day and plan some fantastic interactive read alouds.
Great, thank you.